Hi everybody, welcome to School of Scarlett. I am so happy to have you here today. Today we're going to be talking about the ego. I'm going to be basically showing you all the blind spots of the ego. So you may have watched other videos around the ego. You may know or think you know what the ego is. And so we'll be kind of picking up from there. And I'll be kind of showing you all the blind spots, all the little spots that the tricky little ego tries to sneak back in. And so this is my kind of description of the ego since my awakening. After my awakening, it was very clear to see the little tricky things the ego does because I'm no longer focused on the thoughts. I'm no longer focused on the identity. I'm no longer focused on it being a part of me, adding anything onto me. I'm in more of an observer state. So because of this, my experience of this is totally different. I get to observe the ego and kind of take notes. And because I have a psychology background and this character loves and enjoys all things relating to humanity and the functions of it, I certainly enjoy kind of watching my ego. So what does my ego do? What does other people's ego do? I've gotten to be around a lot of egos in my life. And basically all of us have that aspect to ourselves. It's the aspect of ourselves that is identified. It is the aspect of ourselves that wants to protect an identity. So it has a job to do. It has a job to do in keeping you safe, in keeping you within the norm. So it wants to kind of keep you kind of following the crowd, maybe even keeping up with the Joneses, but really just within a certain little bit of space here. It doesn't really want you to expand too far outside of its own comfort zones. So the ego's job is basically to preserve this identity that you are building or that you are acquiring over time, kind of attaching to different things throughout your life. So what ends up happening at a certain point is we do attach to a lot of different things. And the ego has a lot to work with there, or maybe it doesn't, but either way, it feels that the ego has completed or has created a pretty solid identity for yourself. And all of a sudden now, actually what ends up happening is it actually becomes a prison for you to have to keep up with the demands of the ego, the expectations of what you need to do to still fit in that realm, that little space it has created. It wants you to continue to do those things that you have been doing. So pleasing your parents, pleasing your employer, going to work every day, 9 to 5, not deviating from those things. Following your passions, but only so much. Just a little bit here and there on the weekends, maybe a couple hours. It wants to really constrict you to this identity. It doesn't want you to break out too much from it and align with your heart, which is your true desire. It keeps you in the mind, in the brain, kind of this safety zone, okay? And at some point, you have no other choice than to really disconnect from the heart. And when that happens, a few things happen with the ego. It has different cycles, just like anything in life. So I've written down some different things that I'd like to share with you of the cycles that an ego goes through. So the first one would be that it goes through this cycle of really just taking in information. And this is in the beginning when it's building its identity. But after it has somehow built some sort of identity, some sort, whatever it happens to be, for most of us, what happens is it blossoms into an inferior ego. And this inferior ego is the first aspect of the ego that I noticed develops. And so for me, it was basically this inferior ego, basically coming into situations, always one step down, always feeling like you're inferior to everyone else that's in the room, inferior to all of the experiences that are in the world. So maybe you do want to experience traveling the world, but you feel inferior to it because you feel you're not good enough. You don't have enough money. You don't have the adventurous personality, you don't have a partner. You have all of these excuses of why you're inferior to your heart's desire. So this is the ego's first trick, is to really make you feel very inferior to those things that you truly desire. And it points these things out by very cleverly finding those things within your memory and using them in your thought stream. So really pushing all of those out. Every time you go into a situation you feel uncomfortable, it bombards you with all of those memories and basically identifications of yourself where you have been feeling anxious, inferior in some way, or maybe you have embarrassed yourself, or maybe something has happened that has been traumatic. And so the ego will pull that out and show it to you and say, you see, this is why you can't do this. This is why you're less than these people. This is why this. So for a period there, it's a very torturous time working with the ego. It's a time where we're basically being bullied by our own selves, because the ego is not separate from us. Nothing is really separate from us. So if you can really imagine, throughout this journey, throughout this talk I'm sharing with you, you're actually having a relationship. See it as a relationship with your ego. And on the early stages of the relationship, it's not a very healthy relationship with this particular ego. It becomes very toxic, you could say, meaning this is where a lot of the negative self-talk, negative inner talk is first born and develops. So this is where it comes from. This is where all of that negative self-talk comes from our ego, making us feel inferior for parts of our life. And for some of us, that's our whole life. But at some point, the ego wears on us. And if it works on the other way, making us stronger in the sense of going more into our masculine energy, meaning that now we feel that the ego has pushed us so far that we have to now achieve something. We have to effort something and prove ourselves to the world. So the ego can push us that way through the bullying, so much so that we overachieve. We go out into the workforce, our marriage, or whatever it happens to be, and we overachieve in a way that it now produces something for us. Either that's now we're suddenly the CEO of our company, or suddenly now our marriage is wonderful and we're going through this renewal ceremony or something, or we have something we can now show people that I did this. I'm good enough. I did this and I have something to show for it. Maybe you always dreamed of a beautiful big house and now you have it. Or you dreamed of these cars and now you own them. And so now you have, as they say, receipts to show the world. And so the ego is very proud of this. The ego really owns this and really believes that this is the best and greatest and grandest thing that could ever occur in the reality of this expression. And so what it does is flaunts it. And this is where it switches from treating you as if you're inferior to an energy of being superior. And this is where you find those people with overinflated egos, meaning that now they have gone through those pits of feeling inferior and having that bullying and the ego and the world just treating them like they're nothing. And they've worked and they've pulled themselves out of that hole. And, you know, that wasn't easy for that character. There was a lot of struggle and work, and they see that they put in that work. So they own it as an individual, not as a collective or as oneness. They don't see that yet. They see themselves struggling and how they pulled themselves out of that hole. So there is something to be proud of there. There is something to be protected there now. The ego sees something else there and it's another shiny, bright thing. And now the ego sees, hey, actually, I'm not all that bad. I'm actually very grand and I can do these things and I can achieve these things on my own and I'm not inferior. You've been telling me lies. I'm actually way better than most people. And so the ego begins to inflate rather than deflate like it was in the inferior stage. It's inflating, okay? So it's like, oh, when you drive up in your car, oh, you're better than them. You have way nicer car. You worked way harder than all of those people because you have such nicer car. You are way better because you have such a nicer house, or, you know, you walked in and you have the nicest purse. So you are way better. So the ego is pointing out all of these things now that you have identified with and showing you how those things make you superior than those others. And the same thing can even happen within spirituality. Let's say that you come into an awakening or something like that. The ego can even take that and own it and make it seem to itself and projecting out to the world that it is somehow superior than everybody else out there. And so there is something we have to consider throughout this whole conversation, and any conversation I have with you to come. Everything is all about balance. Just picture anything where you start to feel something imbalance, that yin yang symbol. We have to somehow get back into balance, whether we're thinking of it in polarity of masculine and feminine, or just in general polarity. There is a balance within everything. And within the ego, there's a balance as well. Many people want to kill the ego. Many people want to get rid of the ego. And then on the other side, there's people that don't even want to recognize the ego. They don't even want to talk about the ego. The ego is truly something that's illusory. It's not real, but it's something that is expressing itself in infinity, just like anything else is expressing itself, just like a mushroom expresses itself, just like a star in the sky expresses itself. The ego within the human is expressing something, and it's never going to it's not that you actually kill it, because there's nothing that ever leaves or anything. There's nothing really happening. So what ends up happening is something totally different. You have a transition. Everything's always transitioning, transforming. The impermanence of our reality is congruent throughout our reality. Even within the ego, we can pick anything apart, a nail, fingernail, and we could talk about how it's always changing. Anything, you can bring me anything, is always changing and evolving. It's always in a state of evolution or involution. It's not ever just there. And if it is, it's not going to last very long. So even those that have awakened to a certain state, like people worry about, awakening to a state where they're no longer interacting with the world, they're totally in a state of being. Those beings most likely won't be here very long, because they have completed their cycle. There's a certain level, there's a certain cycle, there's certain cycles that are constantly having in our life, of life and birth and death and rebirth and all of that. And at a certain point, once you come into unity with all that is, and that's unity consciousness, then you merge with all that is. But anyhow, the journey of the ego seems to transform. What the ego was in this stage is not what the ego is in this stage. There's tons of contradictions within the ego, within life, within spirituality. You will never understand this until you experience this, because it cannot be spoken of. The polarities are so different and so crazy that what's true at one level of your life is no longer true at another. And I don't mean levels and hierarchies that anything is better or worse. I just mean in your consciousness. What experience in this consciousness is happening is totally different than what could be happening here. The laws even that govern these things are totally different a lot of times. It's basically at a certain level, it is whatever you say it is. At other levels, it's very limited. Like I say, if we look at the ego, for example, at the very basic level, it's basically a bully. Okay. And then it transforms. Okay. Now the ego is acting as if it's superior to everybody. And now it has a superiority complex, where before it was being bullied. Now it's being it's being expanded, but not in a very healthy way, because it's pointing towards the identity that's a false identity. It's not the true identity. So at a certain point, it's actually going to get painful, because the dissonance between how grand the ego believes the false identity is to the dissonance of the true identity within the heart. So the pain of that's felt within the heart's here beating with its true self. And although it loves that it's now superior and feeling better about itself, it's becoming further away from itself somehow. And it's actually producing more pain in that state than it did when it was feeling totally inferior. The pain of this is way worse, because the polarity has switched, has been pulled so far on each end. So what's going to happen, just like tension in anything, like a tension in a rubber band, it's going to break. And when it breaks is what we call that dark night of the soul, that really going inwards, really breaking, literally breaking as an identity. Okay. So in this state, it really begins to break. And what happens when we begin to break? Most of the times when we begin to break, and I can tell you from my experience, I've had different awakenings, life and death and rebirth cycles in my life. Well, on the earlier stages where I had those stages of death, the rebirth came from pleading to God. Okay. At those stages of very early stages of switching the ego over, that naturally occurs. What naturally occurs when you're in this state of such big dissonance and pain is you reach out to God. So that happened to me around the time where I was around 18 or something. And I got back into church, got baptized. I felt Christ consciousness from time to time. I had that connection, certainly did. But the difference here is that what happens is we go from the inferior ego to the superior ego to the attached ego. So now we're not feeling inferior, nor are we feeling superior, because man, we thought we were superior, but man, no. Actually, there's a part of us we have not been showing the world, and we realize, yeah, all of those accomplishments were great, but the truth is there's something else I need to work on. So this is where we kind of let that superiority go and become a little bit more humble. And so what happens next is that pleading, and we attach to a religion, we attach to a group, we attach to our relationship, to our job. There's a certain kind of attachment that happens here. Some people attach to other entities such as angels, those spirits and things that they feel are communicating with them. And they begin to have these attachments, not in a healthy way, not in a way to say, I am that, and those are supporting me. That is not seen yet. So we can't judge that because it's not seen yet. So what's happening here is the ego is now attaching to that entity or that outside supposed power it thinks it feels it has now. So if that's, let's say, a religion and God, suddenly that ego attaches strongly to the idea of that particular God. No other God. You can't bring in, you can't tell about some other religion. You can't share your experience. It has now locked in this as its holy grail. And so now it's needing this attachment. And for me, this was a time where I just believed flat out, and I still picture it and feel it just totally. It's this feeling of knowing 100% that there is just no other thing to explore here. It's almost like a sense of arrogant kind of energy. Like, my religion is way better than yours. There is no way. Yours does not make sense. Kind of this arrogant thing. And this attachment of my religion has done all of this for me. So there's no way and nothing that you can tell me about yours that could change my idea of mine, because mine has actually done this. And you see, religion and God is doing this for everybody. That's why everybody's saying these things. But we close ourselves off to listen or to know anybody else's perspective. So we always think that ours is the only one that's correct. Which there's nothing right or wrong about that. That's just what's happening. It's the progression of things, and there's nothing right, or I wouldn't suggest you change that. It's just what's happening. So for a lot of people, they stay in this attachment mode for the rest of their lives, and they lead pretty healthy, lives. For some, they're more attached than others, but for the most part, it's something that, a lot of people do, and it's pretty normal to see this. But for the non-dual or an awakened path, what ends up happening if you release a little bit more into that attachment, see, attachments is what really keeps us here present as being these expressions. If we didn't have attachments, if we just flat out didn't have attachments, we literally would cease to exist. There would be no reason for us to exist. And the polarity of that energy literally would disintegrate us into a different sort of energy. We would become formless and transform and move throughout into something different. So we cannot just stay in this kind of state of, let's say, unconditional love. We have to attach to something. There has to be some sense of survival that is happening in order for us to physically manifest as we are and to continue to do the things we are. For me to be speaking on this video, there has to be a sense of me wanting to survive here. There has to be a sense of attachment at some level. So there always will be, as long as you're existing in duality, okay? So that is going to continue to exist. But what ends up happening on the awakened path, the final path into unity, is basically it transforms from basically this attachment to something outside of us to nothingness. We literally discover that everything is nothing. And so our ego, it's not that it dies, it's that everything dies. It's not that that ego dies, or we have to say it's an ego death. No, literally everything dies. If you're just seeing that the ego died, then you're not seeing the grand scope of the profound, deep meaning of nothingness and what this truly is. So you haven't experienced that. But the loosening of attachments is what kind of opens or lays out the red carpet for this to happen. So when we are so attached to our material possessions because they meant so much to us, it's harder to release them. And so we just kind of stuck in this loop. But at some point, life may push you to have to release them, whether that's through something you're not wanting to do, whether that's an illness, whether that's a death, whether that's existential crisis, whether that's the loss of a job, the loss of some sort of ability you have. Something will happen to kind of push you to do this because life is not wanting to stay still. So either life is going to unconsciously push you to do this through kind of unpleasant events, the majority of the time, or you can consciously choose here and now to believe and have faith, to follow your heart. I know that in the Bible it says you need to just have the faith of a mustard seed. You don't need to see the whole plan. You don't need to see everything in reality showing and pointing you this. All you need to have is a little bit of faith in who? In yourself, in your own sacred heart. See, you have a throne there that you can sit on at any time. And when you sit on that throne, guess what? There's no ego messing around. There's no ego messing around making you feel inferior, superior, making you feel like you're attached to something. It's not doing any of that stuff. It's just floating there, and now it's, hey, I'm at your service. Whatever you happen to need now, I am your faithful servant. So now the ego transforms after the state of nothingness, after it's seen what it truly is. It transforms itself into basically a servant. And what it does is whatever work you want it to do. So now as you're working with your heart and you begin to have that faith to follow your heart, you do that for a little while and it seems like, oh, I'm just doing this and I don't have a lot of help and it's just me. Well, as long as you have that little faith of a mustard seed, in no time, if you just hang on, that divine energy is going to come in and your life will be changed for the rest of it. Because what happens is that divine energy meets you and creates a flow energy, which is basically meeting the ego and saying to the ego, hey, you're part of this too. It alchemizes. It basically transmutes the ego from being this fearful kind of limited character that's always trying to hang on and attach and make itself something, to seeing itself as a divine helper, having a beautiful role here in an unfolding of the heart. And it now sees itself as basically something very needed here, and it doesn't see itself as something separate anymore. It has completely merged and become seamless with that divine energy. So there's no separateness feeling, there's no inferior feeling, there's no superior feeling, there's no attachment. There's just service. And so now you're working with all parts. So if you're wanting to know what I'm talking about, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, or maybe you're sure, but you're not sure how that applies to your life or how that is going to unfold in your life, then I have created a course called the Unconditional Course. It's a course that reorients you to your sacred heart. See, most of us are all functioning in the brain the majority of the time. See, the brain is our friend, but we have to have a connection between the brain and the heart. And it has to be a connection that is active, that is open, that, you know, we are in line with our heart. If we are cut off from our heart, we're cut off from our true selves. And if we're cut off from our true selves, we're cut off from everything. We're cut off from life. You're not functioning here consciously. And you see, we always think that the ego is making us do all of these things and do all of these other things. The truth is we're allowing it. And now that you've watched this video, now that you're conscious of this, then it is now your responsibility as the vehicle and vessel that you are watching this to take ownership and to start being that creator consciousness that you always have been. Step into that role. You're not some peasant. You're not some confused being. You're not inferior. You don't have to pretend to be superior. You don't have to attach to things to make yourself special. You are worthy. You are special. You are loved in yourself as yourself. And you, my friend, are the greatest and grandest thing in this universe because you did it. You are this. You manifested everything and anything in here. So how in the world are you inferior to it? And if you don't see that, I encourage you to get on the path of reorienting to your heart. Partner with me either through a one-on-one session or an unconditional course. I have listed all my products in the description and in the comment section for you. I hope that you will share this video if you gained knowledge or wisdom from it. If it felt like it was opening your heart, please share this video with others so that they may also feel this and that they may also share this message. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all.